Thank you, Manfred. So, as on first side, I'm in charge of introducing this Adam Smith seminar, and today we are pleased to welcome Martin Leroch. I hope I pronounced it well. Anyway, Martin is a professor of economics and ethics at Pforzheim, and sorry for the pronunciation, University in Germany since fall 2020. His research relates to the economics of crime, law and economics, and analysis of group behavior. So please, Martin, feel free to tell me if my information is outdated or wrong. I also understood that Martin made his PhD in Hamburg, and he was lucky, or maybe not, I don't know, to have Manfred as a supervisor. I think that's it about all your personal characteristics. And the title of today's presentation is, I have my notes there, United, we help less, the effect of Team Europe on contributions to Covax. So maybe you did not hear about Covax, and I should explain very quickly what this presentation is about. So Covax is a global collaboration, complex collaboration with the aim to secure access to COVID-19 vaccines to low and medium income countries. And in that collaboration, there is a set of partners. I have a list there. Mainly the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, the World Health Organization, Gavi, which is a vaccine alliance, including both the private and public sector, and the UNICEF. And from what I understood, the UNICEF was in charge of delivering those vaccines to the targeted countries. So this is the supply side somehow, but you need to understand that several countries are also contributing to this program. For instance, China, Canada, USA, and several European countries. And this Team Europe, which is the title of the presentation, is actually a huge collaboration in itself as well, because it includes the member states, but also the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So from this short description of this Covax program, I guess you understand that this is a complex organization which offers a nice playground for any researcher interested in the analysis of the logic of collective action. And as indicated by Moncure Olson in his famous book in 1965, you know that the more people there are in this kind of collective action, well, maybe the less efficient this collective action will be. But I'm sure that Martin will have much more interesting things to say than this obvious statement. And so now I guess I will let Martin explain what he has in mind with his presentation. So I think you have approximately 45 minutes, I guess, because we need also time for comments and discussion. So thank you very much. And Martin, feel free to start your presentation now.
Well, thank you first of all for the very kind introduction and already pointing towards the main issues of the presentation. So now that you heard most of the things, maybe they won't be as unfamiliar as they might have been initially. I need to apologize in advance because you're actually attending a double presentation. I have my daughter here standing right in front of me. She's 2 years old. So in case you hear any odd sounds or so, that's probably her. And I might have to dive underneath my table on one or the other occasion. So I hope this runs well. So I have to somehow deal with that. And this will also have an impact on the length because I think I will not need 45 minutes. I will try to cut it short. That said, well, as indicated, sort of this is basically an analysis. First of all, this is joint work with Natasha Zorn from the European Institute at the LSE. And it's actually part of a wider project where we try to analyze how Europe positions itself on a global scale. And in this particular project, what we're doing is we're trying to analyze exactly how Europe positions itself or tries to use, if you so please, one specific initiative, one specific international initiative to possibly increase its international reputation. So to begin with, as indicated, the Team Europe is basically a new approach, if you so please, by the European Union, which is designed to increase or intended to increase the visibility of the European Union as a unitary actor. This need for such a unitary actor visibility comes primarily in the presence of two, well, let's say upcoming actors on that domain, namely China and Russia, who particularly over the COVID-19 crisis took strong efforts to use all kinds of leverages that they have in order to foster their international reputation. So some of you might still recall that in the very outset of the pandemic, when Italy particularly was hit extremely hard, China had quite a big media attention because they delivered the first facial masks. What was a bit more covered in, or less covered in that way in the media was that the European Union sent quite an amount of equipment to China in order to help China as well. That is something that basically nobody was too aware of, but everybody was made aware of China helping Italy. So in this sort of environment, the European Union inter alia tried to increase its own visibility. And the thing that we are actually not able to estimate, at least at this stage or in this project, is whether or not this visibility aim was achieved. So what we actually do is we take a sidestep and ask ourselves, okay, well, this is an initiative which tried to increase contributions, like what I mean with this initiative is Covax. I will get to Covax in a minute. But at this stage, what I mean is that Covax was an initiative to elicit money to get money on an international level. Now we're calling Italy. Excuse me. So this was an initiative to really get funds made available in order to basically get vaccination covered throughout the world. And what we are asking is whether this Team Europe approach then was possibly also beneficial in achieving more. Excuse me, we're calling Italy again. May I just give me a second? Excuse me. Okay. Yeah, now the phone is locked. Anyways, so whether this Team Europe approach might have been beneficial in raising more funds than otherwise or not. That's basically the issue that we're trying to deal with here. So as also already mentioned in the introduction, Covax is basically one of the WHO's primary initiatives in order to get money into its hand, which is then used, first of all, to develop and then secondly, manufacture vaccines, but also then to guarantee a free and equitable access, as they say it themselves, to every country in the world, primarily to the developing countries. Now you have to bear in mind that this initiative was actually raised or initiated in the summer of 2020. And in the summer of 2020, obviously there were no vaccines available yet. Nobody had any clue how long that would take. And there was a great fear actually that that might not have actually been successful, or that might not be successful in due time, so that we might have suffered the pandemic for quite an extensive period of time. So that is when this initiative was raised, basically. It then evolved in certain phases or rounds, in the sense that initially the idea of Covax was simply to open up a facility, as it's called, and then asking donors to just contribute money, and then the hope was that at the end of the year, or possibly in early 2021, there would have been sufficient resources, financial resources available. However, this didn't happen. So what the WHO then did, or Covax did, was they called for a limited time span and said that, I don't recall the exact date, but I think it was February 2021. So they said that by February 2021, we need a specific amount of money. And yet again, this initiative failed a bit. So they fell a bit short of this initially aimed at money. What they then did was call for a second phase, which then lasted until the summer of 2021, and then a third phase, which was from the mid of 2021 till the end of 2021. And they then argued, okay, so we want a specific amount of money until then and then and then. And the third phase would then phase out, if you so please, meaning that now everybody is still free to contribute, obviously, but there's no more this engagement in specific or particular rounds. It's rather now, okay, you might join and you might not join. I should also note that there are more layers to that. So what we're focusing on is only the financial contributions. Maybe some of you recall or note from the media that you can also practically donate vaccines that you haven't used up yourself. So you can just throw that into the pot for the Covax countries as well. This is not what we're focusing on. We're exclusively focusing on the money here. As of April 2022, that's the latest data point that I use here in this analysis, which I'm about to present. The financial contributions overall came from, first of all, 27 individual countries, that is outside of Europe. It also came from the so-called Team Europe. As also explained, this is basically 20 member states on the whole, plus the European Commission basically contributing money, and by more than 50 private sector agents. So this means, for instance, we have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which were one of the large donators. We also have larger firms donating quite amounts of money, and also some private people in general. So that's a huge range basically of donators donating to this initiative. As stated, I use the data as of April 2022. So that is basically the last period when I really checked for that data and amended those data. I have now recently, that is towards the end of last year, figured that there have been some changes to this to these latest data. It's only minor changes, but still they occur. And this to me is a bit funny because the date that they claim the data are from is still April 2022. So something odd happened on the website of Covax here in that regard. But so therefore it might be something like an intermediate analysis that you see. Possibly some of the results might change, but I don't hope that will be the case. So what are the states now which contribute to Covax? Again, this is only the monetary component. This is not the how many vaccines or shots individually have you donated or so. This is only about the money. And what you can see from this world map here, basically it's the usual suspects, of course. So we have countries like Sweden, we have countries like the United States, we also have countries like Germany and France. But we also have more peculiar figures. So for instance, China is amongst the donators, which is relatively new. They're not donating as much as many other countries are, but still they're donating. We also have Brazil and Colombia amongst the donators. So also two countries which are not the common or usual suspects in the field of international development aid, which we take as a reference basically here. We also see, more strikingly now, new actors on stage like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, also countries which over the past 5 years at best basically began donating in larger amounts, also on an international scale. And we also see some countries which usually are on the recipient side of donations, particularly the Philippines, Vietnam, and also Bhutan. So Bhutan has donated, I think it was $100,000 US dollars. But still, usually they're on the recipient side and not on the donating side. Related or regarding the Team Europe, what we have here then is, well, similarly in the case of Europe, the usual suspects. So we have Sweden, we have Finland, we have Germany, France, Spain, and you name it. But we also have some countries which are not very open donators, let's put it this way, usually. That is Estonia and Poland. We also have Slovenia and Croatia here on that list. So it seems to be the case that this Covax initiative was successful in, well, getting funds from new actors, if you so please, but that's at this stage only a first look at the picture in that sense. So what now is the specific research question that we are addressing here in this paper? What we want to know is whether the contributions to Covax, or what explains these contributions to Covax from members of Team Europe. And this research question falls into two sub-questions. The first question is, does membership in Team Europe address the well, the probability or the likelihood to contribute at all? That is binary. Do you send at least $1 or not? And the second question then is, how much do these individual countries donate? So it's a two-step question basically that we're addressing. Why do we come up with this with these two parts? Well, only very briefly, since I guess that most of you are familiar with theory of public goods and so on. I will keep this very brief. We are basically addressing the theory which relates to public goods in general, and from the theory, based on theory, you can, at least to my understanding, make two bigger arguments. The one would be, well, if you're pooling this under a bigger umbrella, that is Team Europe, what you can do is you can possibly raise peer effects in the sense of you might pull people into the team which usually aren't part of the team by simply stating, well, come on, we as Europe have to do something. Maybe the one or the other actor then foresees, okay, this is something that we indeed need to do, so maybe I'm convinced and I will join the team actively. And that would be a positive effect, obviously. Then we also have the natural negative side to that. That is, what we're having is something like a public good, if you think of it globally, or you could possibly also think of this as a club good, if you think of Team Europe only as a club as such, which then obviously has the problems that you have the option or the possibility of leaning back on the others' contributions, free riding, and you also have a blurring of strategic incentives to contribute. What we mean here is that typically countries don't donate out of pure altruism, but typically they do so because they want to have some effects with it. These effects are exactly the effects which I already mentioned at the first slide. That is, countries like China and Russia trying to get some reputational effects out of it. This is something that in international relations is, according to my knowledge, more or less standard to assume that countries are no altruistic agents, but they do something only out of self-interested reasons, basically. So from this, we develop primarily two hypotheses. So I say primarily because I will only present what I find the major part of the paper and not some of the minor parts. So our main hypotheses are the following: that the membership in Team Europe leads to an increase in the likelihood to contribute. So due to, for instance, things like peer pressure, but it likewise might lead to a reduction in the overall amounts contributed by individual countries due to free riding or the reduced, as I call it then, strategic incentives. What we then do is we try to measure that empirically. So what we then obviously do as a first step is we measure how much these countries contribute. And what we do is we approach this question or this task in general pretty much as the standard literature on ODA, that is on development aid, is addressing these questions. That is, first of all, we take the contributions as a dollar amount and then divide that by the national income in order to have an income accounted for measure here. We then finally only multiply by 100 to get well-readable coefficients, if you so please. As indicated, these contributions were practically made in 3 phases. I will leave this phase discussion aside for the moment, and I only refer to the overall contributions. That is, after round 3, what have, that is, by April 2022, what have the different countries contributed? On the whole, we also try to exploit the potential of quite a bunch of independent variables. These independent variables are basically selected based on the empirical literature of factors explaining ODA. This is our natural point of reference. We basically consider contributions to Covax more or less one specific form of ODA, that is development aid. We then additionally add the COVID death toll. The idea being that we argued that, well, if you are struck pretty hard by COVID, maybe you don't have the resources to finance investments in other places. And on the other hand, you can make the argument, maybe if you're struck hard by COVID, you know what it means to be struck by COVID. So therefore, you will try to help others, well, to larger degrees, to basically get over it or to help to overcome it. That's our first additional factor, which we include here on top of these factors explaining ODA. And we also add a dummy variable for EU member states. You now might wonder why I have this word potential in brackets up there, so 23 potential independent variables. Well, this has to do with the method that we're using. Why is that? Well, we only have a limited number of observations. Well, you all know that we only have roughly 200 countries in the world, and now we want to throw 23 independent variables at this data set. That would be a bit overstressing things. So we are running, in other words, into the problems of high dimensional data. That is pretty much explanatory variables compared to pretty low numbers of observations. How we address this problem is that we first of all use what is called the post double selection method. That is basically a data-driven process to select variables. So it's nothing where we can say, well, we want this variable, or at least we don't do it. We want this or that variable included. The only variable which we state that we want to have included is EU membership as a dummy variable. But apart from that, we basically let this data-driven process select the variables. And then what we do is, in a second step, we take all these covariates which were selected by this post-double selection method and use them in a, first of all, Heckman model, which, as you probably know, includes exactly this two-tier structure. That is, the first thing is it estimates the likelihood that you have a non-zero number. And the second thing that it then does is it adds on a regression, basically, which then tries to regress the overall amounts contributed. We use the Heckman model as our primary reference because the Heckman model assumes that the binary decision to contribute or not is not independent from the decision how much you donate. There's an alternative model which does not make that assumption, and that's the two-part model. We also use this two-part model for the reason, or for pure technical reasons, namely that typically the two-part model, sorry, now I have to dive, because the two-part model is typically more efficient when covariates are highly correlated, as we have it in our scenario here. So we use just these two different regression procedures just in order to be on the safe side regarding some technicalities here. What is it that we find? So I here on the right-hand side basically present the reduced output. The reduced output is, first of all, falling into two different pairs of columns. The first one is the Heckman model, and the second one is then the two-part model. In the first column, underneath the Heckman, or the word Heckman, you see the wording select, and then you see level next to it. This relates to exactly these two regressions that we're running. The first one, the select, is the one which aims to analyze the likelihood of contributing. That is the binary choice, yes or no. And the second, the level, oops, excuse me, now somebody was again clicking here. The second column, the level column, is then the regression. Provided that you are contributing, what is it, or what are the factors explaining how much you contribute? Then in the two corresponding columns on the two-part model, we have this very same exact idea. That is the select binary kind of regression, and the level, the standard regression, basically, to which all this refers. In both regressions, I do include a set of controls. I can go into details then towards the end if you please, but I think it's a very convoluting output, so I restricted myself to this controls, yes, 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 yes. And what you see now is related to the very first row here, to the one indicating the European Union, or the coefficient related to the dummy variable European Union. And you figure that in both these select columns, the coefficient is positive, but it has no asterisk associated with it. So this basically means that we find no statistically significant support, at least, for what we term a peer effect in this presentation of this Team Europe. That is, the likelihood of countries of the European Union joining this Covax initiative is not significantly measurable in that sense. Although it's, you have to admit that, positive. So it would make sense to at least assume some degree, if you so please, of this initiative. On the other hand, looking at the level coefficients, you see that both in the two-part and in the Heckman model, these coefficients are negative, implying, first of all, that we do see this public goods effect, as we called it, and it's also significantly different from zero. So there seems to be some evidence favoring this negative effect of countries contributing less due to this pooling of reputation, if you want to use that wording. We then also delved a bit deeper into the question related to this reputation, because I think this is a pretty important thing, at least on the international domain, to understand why different countries contribute and whether the excuse me again, I have to whoops, dive again underneath my table, and now you give me this one because this is not nice. Excuse me for a second. She's now okay. Up. Okay. So there you go. Okay, because I do think it's important to really sort of understand why member states might donate to these international endeavors on a larger scale. So what we, for instance, did was we then tried to figure whether we can say something more about whether it's really something like this reputational effect that matters here. Because you could, for instance, argue, yes, fair enough, that people don't, or that individual countries don't donate as much as they would. If this if this Team Europe perspective is an option, for the simple reason that they might, for instance, distrust the administration involved with Team Europe or so. That would be just one scenario that, or one reason, one argument that could potentially pop up. So we wanted to figure, is there another way to figure whether reputation really might matter? So in order to get there, we argued as follows. So what we basically do with our approach is we measure an average effect across all EU member states. That is what we do with our dummy variable here. Now we reason as follows. If it were true that some of these countries at least value this reputation effect, that is, they typically donate only for the sake of increasing their own reputation, then we would first of all expect these countries to donate more in general to ODA, that is to development aid in general. Okay, now not specifically aimed at Covax, but in general, you would then assume all else equal, these countries would donate more because there's reputation for them at play. Now, taking this argument, if this reputation effect were indeed reduced by the EU's Team Europe pooling strategy, then we would expect that exactly these countries, those which typically donate a lot, would donate even less, or would donate less in this Team Europe approach. And because we cannot account for this value of reputation that each individual country assigns to the reputation, what we would do is we would systematically overestimate the contributions of those countries which are seeking this reputation and underestimate those from others. So put differently, what we would have is we would have a systematic structure within our residuals. So the residuals for reputation-seeking countries should actually be negative because we overestimate their contributions and underestimate the contributions from others. And this, pretty much to our surprise in that sense, is actually indeed given in the data. So what we have here is on the x-axis just the general ODA level that these countries in general that we include in our analysis contribute as percentage of the national income. And on the y-axis, we have the residuals that we estimate in our estimations. And you see now that we have the darker dots here. The darker dots are basically ordered along more or less a linear trend, with the exception of Italy, Germany, and Sweden. But this tells us that indeed, first of all, there seems to be a linear relationship, or at least some relationship, between this ODA and our residuals that we have at hand. More strikingly, this relationship is also not visible in the non-EU countries. So it seems to be the case that for these EU countries, there is indeed something that is at odds with, or at least compared with the other countries. So in our terms, then, we find that this is an additional support, at least for our hypothesis, that it is something like this reputation seeking that is most likely at stake here. That is, countries would like to donate only if there's reputation effects for them involved. We also did similar analysis of these residuals related to sites, related to geographic location within the European Union, and so on. And we couldn't find any similar structure, which really sort of is telling in that sense as this one here. So therefore, we are pretty confident actually that this does take up at least something, although obviously we can't prove it finally or ultimately. What is the implication of all this? Well, this Team Europe approach, as indicated, well, is a new kind of way of the European Union approaching the international sphere in that sense, and it has recently been extended to other forms, to other policies of external cooperation. For instance, under the Team Europe Democracy Initiative, that has nothing to do with fundraising primarily, but with the European Union calling for the rule of law across the globe, and other democracy relevant variables here. So given this implication that were the relevance of this, we now stand here united, and given our results that, well, individual countries may contribute, but primarily they contribute only, or not only, but they primarily contribute if there's something in that bucket basically for them as well. We might find it worthwhile to think about the strategy of the European Union and try to somehow enhance the incentives for member states to contribute, just in order to compensate for this reduction in the reputation effect that we believe is prevalent here. Okay, so that's already pretty much it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm now more than happy to discuss any of the details as long as my daughter lets me.
Okay, so thank you. Well, I didn't have the paper or any paper, so I have two questions. I can start the discussion, of course. I have a first remark, Martin. Maybe you can tell me whether this is relevant or not, but from what I understood, the question of the number of observations is very important because you deal with a low number of observations. From your table, I saw 144 and 40, depending on the question which was addressed. And for that reason, especially because you find no support for a peer effect, so meaning that if there is no effect, there are two possibilities. Either there is indeed no effect at all, or you fail to detect an effect because your number of observation is too low. And when you are facing this kind of issue, usually what you do is to provide some power computation. Don't you think that would be relevant in your case? So this is my first question or suggestion. And something also that wasn't clear to me, but it's the end of the day, maybe I'm tired, but I'm sure you will try to clarify those two terms. You were talking about a peer effect, and in the meantime, you were talking about a reputational effect. And I've been working a little bit on experimental economics, and usually peer effects are explained by two things: norm-based effects, you would like to look like the others, and a reputational effect, where you care about your reputation. And those two items So basically norm and reputation explain peer effects. So maybe either there is something I didn't understand, but maybe you could try in your presentation to explain the difference between peer effect and reputation, because from where I'm coming from, those two things are highly related. And those are my two questions and interpretation, but obviously if you have a working paper, I would be very happy to read it and to provide further comments on it.
Excellent. Thank you. Let me, first of all, you got like the two things perfectly correct. So the first thing is that the power calculation is something that is still on the to-do list. And you're perfectly correct in pointing out that we have low numbers of observations. So what we basically have in this level analysis is, well, we have this 144 countries which run into our regression. And we basically have 5 explanatory factors for that. So it's true. I mean, 5 related to 144 is relatively low in standards, or at least compared to other empirical work in that sense. So indeed, that would be one of the explanatory factors. On the other hand, at least compared to the pretty strong significant effect of the level regression, sort of, I'm wondering whether this is truly the only factor that we have. But it's correct that power calculation should actually be done, and as indicated, it is on the to-do list. I'm hesitant to say that, but I have to admit that this is a paper which is on my desk for updating and so on for almost a year by now. So, but yeah, I just didn't get to it so far. But perfectly right. It could well be that, particularly also given the size of the effect, it seems somewhat striking that the confidence interval is so huge, right? So could well be that this is driven by the low numbers of observations. Regarding the peer effect and the reputation effect, that is just my poor wording in that sense. And my only excuse at this stage, first of all, is that I used both terms in quotation marks because I didn't have any better wording for that. So the idea of the peer effect in our terms was simply, well, the others who are part of the same club, you know, they, in one way or the other, exert some pressure which makes you join the club or participate. This could be norm-based, true. It could be reputational-based, but rather reputational-based within the club. Whereas in this reputation-based argument that we put forward, what we refer to is, well, the external perspective. That is, if say you as France, you contribute something to ODAs in general, or to some countries in particular, you donate to those countries because you want to increase your reputation vis-a-vis that country. And it's less so the reputation that you might gain within the European Union or so. So this is the reason why I chose these two wordings. They're imperfect. There's no doubt about that. So maybe I should then also have a look at sort of, or at least search for some better terminology for that. I hope that clarifies it at least a bit, that sort of true. We have this reputation effect within the club, but again, in our case, it's rather the reputation that you want to gain outside that club.
Okay, thank you, Martin. It was much clearer indeed, and maybe working on it and to provide the definition in the first place at the beginning of the presentation or the paper would be indeed a good solution to solve that issue. So I guess maybe there are additional comments from other people.
Yeah, I have a small comment because reputation, of course, well, these governments, you know, who decide here, they, of course, they have also a kind of problem of legitimacy. I mean, it's they have to have reputation with respect to their voters, and so this, of course, opens a completely different basket, you know. But I would say, I mean, if you want to get a full picture, you know, then more or less you have to look inside, you know, these various countries too, and maybe you could find, you know, that expenditures depend, about the coalitions you find in these various government structures, in these countries. So one idea is if there's more competition in the country, maybe the contribution to this Team Europe is smaller, or whatever it is. But this is this is a consideration I have, because when I look at some of talks and conversations, discussions we had recently here, it was always, the question is, does, for instance, Germany have to pay for its reputation by giving their money to this project or not? I mean, in general, people tend to be very generous when it comes, of course, to health and so, but still there is this question. So it could be interesting to look at the political structure of the various countries, and maybe you find a kind of correlation with respect to this kind of reputation effect.
True. So let me just reply very briefly. One of these potential variables which could be selected in our case was the variable whether you're a left or right-leaning government. This doesn't pick up all the pictures or all the things that you just mentioned, because in some cases you need a larger coalition, in others you don't. You have first past the post systems, proportional systems. So it could obviously be way more than that. But at least this one variable was amongst those which we, let's say, offered to this process, basically to this data-driven process to select those covariates. But it's true that sort of the internal perspective is something that we don't look at in greater detail, and that should probably be worthwhile doing.
Okay, thank you.
Well, if you allow me, maybe I would ask another question about clarification. Are you looking at the timing of the contribution? Because this also would be about reputation and leadership. And are you following other countries, or are you doing everything on your own? I mean, do you have data about this, and are you considering it in your analysis?
That was initially our idea, particularly because there were end dates to these phases. So our idea was exactly to somehow get hand on data which measure when which country makes which choice. We don't have that data. We only have these phase data, basically. And in the first phase, what we have as a problem is very few countries donating in the first place. We then in phase 2 have it that most countries join there, and those which already donated in the first phase, they only add, if at all, a margin. And the same thing happens then in phase 3. So we have a slight extension of the number of countries contributing and possibly topping some of the donations. But the big step is the one between phase 1 and phase 2. And we didn't see any way of reasonably making an analysis of exactly these steps. So that's, but initially that was exactly the idea, right? Do some countries take the lead and others follow?
Okay, it makes sense. Thank you, Martin. Other questions, suggestions?
Yeah, to follow on from what you just said, I don't know if it is Mansur Olson or Dennis Miller. I saw somewhere one of them gave a numerical example, illustration of countries joining in providing a public good like environmental benefit to all. The sequence in which countries might join would depend on their perception of the likelihood of the effect. So a small country might join saying that, well, if I give a small amount of money, the impact would be very little. Whereas they may join if there are others who are also giving money, and the impact would be greater. Now, there are two things that would happen there. One would be the sequence in which they join, which was the question that was raised before. The other is the quantity that is raised. If more is raised, then more people might join in on the assumption that it might actually make a bigger impact. It might hit the news, so there would be a much greater benefit, if that's what you're looking for, propaganda benefit, that would follow from the contribution. Now, I don't know if you can, in your data, separate these kinds of effects.
So if I'm not mistaken, what you're aiming at is what I think Dennis Miller called the exploitation of the large by the small. I think that's sort of the phrase or something like that he's referring to. So what we can do with the data is we can have a look at size, obviously. So we can sort of include size or look at sort of the residual structures as we did with the ODAs in that sense. So that's something that we actually did do. So we were looking at whether size of a country in terms of GDP, whether size of a country in terms of inhabitants, number of inhabitants, has any systematic impact. And in our scenario, at least in our data, it doesn't. But that's as far as it goes. We don't, for the reason just stated towards Benoit, we don't have the true option of having the sequential analysis, because all we see is these well, collective chunks of, well, this is what then happened, and all of a sudden you see this increase in numbers. And it's not the case that it's primarily the large member states or the large countries initially donating. Bhutan was amongst the first countries to donate, for example. I mean, this is n=1 scenario, but still it is relatively telling. This is a small country, very small country, extremely poor country, which it was amongst the first to offer money in that sense. So that's as far as it goes. But it's also pretty valuable. Thank you for that comment, to just have another kind of look at that picture. Who would be the countries to expect to donate at possibly even what stage?
Yes, Stan.
Okay, Stan, go ahead, please.
A couple of questions. First, you have some numbers in your table of results. Can you give us some general understanding of how big these numbers are? I mean, in terms of the total contribution, to what extent can you attribute the reputation effect to this total contribution by some average countries? Do you have some kind of numbers, like some sense of that?
So what we did was we calculated the hypothetical counterfactuals using the adequate variables for each country, and then asking whether changing from EU member to non-EU member would have, or what would be the size of the impact, because we have two different steps involved. The first one is the likelihood that you contribute in the first place, and then secondly, once you are a member, sort of how much would the donation increase. And according to those numbers, the average contribution of EU members would double. But I'm pretty hesitant to sort of, I mean, it's spelled out in the current version of the paper, but I'm not sure whether I want to keep it there. I mean, it is telling on the one end, and I don't want to sort of downplay the role of data in that sense. But on the other hand, I feel a bit uncomfortable with the size of those numbers.
Well, of course, the size matters. I mean,
true. But it's, I mean, reading like it would actually be the double number is
well, I mean, if those are the numbers, those are the numbers. Eh?
True.
You know, there's nothing wrong with saying what they mean. And a somewhat different question. Could you play out your analysis with respect to NATO contributions to Ukraine?
I think it would work, yeah. If I have the adequate numbers available, that should work as well, yeah. It's a good idea, which we haven't thought about actually.
Yeah, and you might have a problem with the numbers of observations, but if you think of it as a panel data, dynamic panel data problem, you could use you could expand the number of observations that way. That might be of interest to do this kind of application.
No, that's a great idea actually. We haven't thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
No.
Virginia,
I have a
please go ahead.
question. especially regarding this remark about donation to Ukraine. Do you consider donation from the European Union as a whole? So I guess for Ukraine, for example, the European Union centralized with a decision made in Brussels, donate quite a big sums of money, I guess. So I didn't really follow, but I assume it maybe the same happens actually with COVID help as well. Maybe part of the nation just go through. Oh, so sweet. So go
Yeah, sorry.
through. No, it's go through Brussels. Let's put it like this. So it's about proportions, about I don't know, two-step decisions, country internally deciding to donate something, then they pull up, and then Brussels decide what to do with the money. So kind of such a mechanism exists.
That is what I mentioned as one potential argument for why countries do not donate as much as they would typically do, because they're afraid, or they could be afraid, that the money is badly invested and runs into all kinds of administrational issues. And there's also another analysis which I have omitted, and which I actually haven't, or the results of which I don't really have in mind at the moment. I mentioned that the European Commission is also one of these donators, and actually the European Commission is the second largest donator after the United States. And one analysis that we included was to argue, well, the contributions we're looking at are the deliberate contributions of you as an individual country, but you already donate via the standard budget of the European Commission to some degree. So what we then did was to divide that share, that overall share that the European Commission is donating, by the individual share that each member state makes to the budget of the European Commission, and then argue maybe this is also an explaining factor, so that countries have the perspective that, well, individually, I don't have to contribute or donate anymore, because via the European Commission budget, I already do so. That's an additional component, which again, I'm sorry that I'm not able to provide the result of that, because I don't have it in mind. But that's something that we then did on top of that, taking more into account this sort of logic of the European Union, which you're addressing, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you. This is
you
exactly
my
question.
I think we have no further questions and no further comments and so on. So thank you very much for attending this session, and have a good evening and enjoy life. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you all for your comments.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.